Alright. So at this point we have both the front end and back end of our full stack blog application, mostly complete, at least complete enough to actually start bringing the two ends together. Now to get ourselves started here, what you're going to want to do is open up both the front end and back end in your IDE. I usually like to open these up inside the same window, but you can also open them up in separate windows. So what I'm going to do in order to open them up in the same window is just change directories out to the containing directory, and run code. And that will open up both the front and the back end folders inside the same IDE window. Which will make it pretty easy to work with, as you'll see. Alright, so we have the front end and back end now. And our next task is to connect these things, right? Essentially what we want to do is have our front end make the same types of requests that we were making from Postman, but obviously the front end is going to need to make those requests using code. Now, there are several ways to get the front end to do this, but the way that we're going to be doing it is using a library called Axios. Now, Axios is an incredibly popular library for making network requests, and it can be installed into either front-end or back-end projects, and used to make any type of request to pretty much any URL. So we're going to be using this library in order to have our front end make requests to the back end. So this is sort of our front end's Postman, if you will. Alright. So first things first, let's install the Axios library, and we're going to want to install that into our front end directories. So let's open up a terminal, and you're going to want to make sure that you're in the front end directory by saying cd my blog. And once you're there, we're going to install Axios by typing npm install Axios and hitting enter. Okay. So that will install the Axios library for us. So now let's talk about how the Axios library is actually going to be used in our front-end application. Okay, so I'm just going to open up the app.js file here. And I'm just going to use this as an example. I'll just scroll all the way down so that I can use this as a sort of whiteboard, if you will. So the Axios library, it's actually incredibly simple. All you have to do is import it, and once you've imported it, you can make requests to any URL you want by calling Axios and then the type of request you want to make. So if you want to make a GET request, all you need to do is say axios.get, and then the argument that you're going to pass to this is going to be the URL that you want to make this request to. So in our case, we'll want to make the request to http://localhost 8000. And let's say we want to load the article data for some article. We would say /API/articles/ and then we'd have the article ID such as Learn React, alright? And that function, called in the way that we're calling it right here, will make a request to our server. And in order to get the response that our server sends back, all you need to do is say const response = await Axios.get, alright. So most of these functions that Axios provides, like get or post, you can also do axio.post or axio.put. These are all going to be asynchronous, which means that you'll need to use the await keyword with them. Alright. And that will give you the response, the way that you can get the data that the response contains. Right? So if we said response.json, for example on the server side, we could get that by saying const data = response.data. And that's really all there is to it. Alright. Now, there are other things that we might want to do, like add data to the requests that we're sending from Axios, but that's something that we'll take a look at a little later when we get there. So that's the Axios library. And as I said, this is what we're going to be using to tie our front end and back end together. So let's just delete this code here. And the next thing that we're going to want to do is take a look at how to start loading some data into our components. Alright, so now that we've installed the Axios library and we know the basic syntax that it uses, let's take a look at how to load data into our article page from the server. So, the first thing that we're going to want to do here is open up our article page. And this is where we're going to be writing most of our code for this video. So, our basic goal here with loading data is when we visit the article page, right, when one of our article pages is first displayed, we'll want that page to make a request to our server. And we'll want our server, obviously, to send back the number of upvotes and comments for that article, which our article page will then display. So, there's a few steps here. The first thing that we're going to need to do is actually load the data in the first place. And then we'll need to add a few more components and elements down here in our article page's JSX, and create components such as the comment form. So, the first thing that we're going to have to do here in order to be able to load data and use it, is we're going to have to add state to our component, right? Currently, none of our components really have any kind of memory. They're just returning some JSX depending on the props that we pass into them and the hooks that they happen to be using, such as this useProm's hook here. Alright, now the entire point of state in this context is to give us a place to store the response that we get back from the server. So, the first thing that we're going to have to do is import React's useState hook. Now, if you've never used this hook before, this is just the way that in modern React we add state to our components. Alright, and if you've never used this useState hook before, this is just the way that we add state to function components in modern React. So we're going to say import useState from React, and then down here in our article page, what we're going to do is say, const article info and set article info. There we go. Equals useState, and for the default value here, we're going to say upvotes, 0 and comments, empty string or empty array rather. Okay. So what we just did here is we added a state called article info to our article page component. And what we're going to need to do now is make a request to the server and basically just set our article info state using the setArticleInfo function to the data that we get back from the server. And that will replace this default value here that we pass to the useState function. Alright. So, the way that we're going to actually load data is using another React hook. And this other React hook is going to be called useEffect. Now, the entire point of the useEffect hook, in case you're not familiar with it, is to allow us to add logic into our components that will be executed outside of the normal component rendering, right? So, in other words, useEffect hooks are where we want to put most of our logic for doing things like loading data from a server. So, what we're going to do is right underneath where we define our state, we're going to say useEffect. And for now let's just simulate what this useEffect thing will look like by calling setArticleInfo with some fake data. Alright, so we'll say upvotes, and let's just say that we want to set upvotes to 3 and we'll set comments to just an empty array like we had before. Alright, now what we just wrote here is a simulation for what we'll be doing when we actually get back data from the server, which we'll see how to do in just a minute. And it's going to enable us to take a look at a few more complicated aspects of using the useEffect hook to load data. So, now that we have this article info, what we're going to do is head down here to where we have our main JSX for our article page component. And all we're going to do is underneath the article title, we're going to add a paragraph tag that says, this article has. And then we're going to add the number of upvotes that the article has by saying, articleinfo.upvotes, and then after that, we'll say upvotes. And in fact, we'll even put the S inside parenthesis so that it will make it a little more grammatically correct. Great. So, let's try this thing out. What we're going to do is just run our front end, and we can do that by changing directories into our my blog directory. If you're not there already, and running npm run start. And this will of course open up our React app in our browser. And if we go to our article page now by clicking on articles up here and clicking on one of our articles from the list, sure enough, it'll say this article has 3 upvotes. Now, at this point, this data is not actually from the server, right? We just hard-coded that in our useEffect hook, but this is the basic setup and hooks that we're going to be using to actually start loading data from the server. So, that's the next thing we're going to do, is add the Axios library to this component and start making requests. Okay. So we've added state and the useEffect hook to our article page, and we've simulated data loading here. But before we move on to implementing the actual data fetching, right, using Axios, there are 2 more caveats that we need to address. The first one is pretty subtle, but when it shows up, it really shows up. Okay. And if you're wondering what I mean by that and want to see it in action, let's say that for testing purposes, instead of just hard coding the number of upvotes here inside our useEffect hook, we generated a random number of upvotes, between let's say 1 and 10. Alright. So what that would look like, we would say upvotes math.ceiling, and then we would say math.random and multiply that by 10. Right? So that's how you generate a number between 1 and 10, using JavaScript's math.random, in case you weren't aware of that. Alright. So after making that change, what you're going to see if you go back to your browser, is that this upvotes value is updating continuously, and it's just kind of going crazy, right? Now, the reason that this is happening, is that the useEffect hook runs not only when the component first mounts, right when the component is first added to the page, but it also runs whenever the component updates. And since we're updating the component from inside the useEffect hook, using a random number, which is constantly going to give a different value, our component is currently getting caught in an infinite loop. Now there's an easy way to prevent this, and that's by simply adding an empty array, as the second argument that we pass to useEffect. And we'll see why this helps in a second. But first of all, let's just save the file and go back and take a look, and sure enough we'll see that that stopped the infinite loop, and we can just refresh the page, and we'll see that that upvotes number updates automatically. Okay, so let's go back and take a look at this empty array thing. The reason that this empty array thing works, is because basically what the useEffect hook does, is whenever any of the values that are in this array, which currently is nothing, changes, the useEffect hook will execute the logic in this callback function that we pass as the first argument. Alright. So if we were to put this useEffect hook underneath article ID, and pass article ID as a member of this array, then basically what this would do, is whenever the article ID changes, the useEffect hook would call this callback function that we passed as the first argument. Alright. So basically by passing an empty array to useEffect, we're basically telling it that we only want it to call this function that we're passing, when the component is first mounted, right? When the component is first added to the DOM. So that's actually what we're going to want most of the time when we're loading data from the server, is for this useEffect hook logic to only be called when the component is first mounted, because otherwise we would just be making requests to the server every single time the component changed. And that's obviously not what we want. So that's why we pass the empty array here. Alright. So now that we're sure that our useEffect hook logic is getting called at the right time, all we really have to do is, instead of setting our article info state to fake random data as we've been doing, we just need to load this data from the server and call setArticleInfo with the response that we get from the server instead. So the first thing that we're going to want to do here, of course, is import the Axios package. And to do that, we just need to say import Axios from Axios, and then down here, inside useEffect, what we're going to do is use the Axios.get function to make a GET request to the server endpoint that will give us back all of the info about the article. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say const response equals await Axios.get, and we're going to put in the URL of our server, which is going to be http://localhost 8000/API/articles, and then we're going to add the article ID here. Actually, what we're going to do is just convert these single quotes to backticks and insert the article name here. So we'll just say article ID, and that means that we need to actually put the article ID above our useEffect hook like so that we have access to it inside of here. Alright. So that's how we make that request, and that's really all we need to do. So once we get the response back, we're going to say const article info equals response.data, right? Remember that we said that's where the data that was included in the response is going to be, and now, we just need to say set article info to article info. And actually, just to be clear here, so that we don't get mixed up with this article info and the article info state, let's call this variable new article info, and then we'll say set article info to new article info. Okay, and that's really all we need to do there. However, there are a few changes that we'll have to make. The first thing is, since we're using the await keyword inside this useEffect callback, you might imagine that we're going to need to add the async keyword to the useEffect function. Alright. However, if we try and run our code now, what you're going to see if we go back to our browser and hit refresh is that nothing's showing up. Now, if you open the inspector window by right-clicking and clicking on Inspect and then going to the console, what you're going to see is this nasty-looking series of errors that basically mean that you're not allowed to pass an asynchronous function as the first argument to useEffect, alright? So what we have to actually do instead is remove the async keyword from this callback function and actually create an internal asynchronous function inside this function. You'll see what this looks like in just a minute. We'll say const load article info equals, and then this is just going to be an asynchronous function like so, and we'll put all of our logic inside of there. And then we just need to call this load article info function after we define it. Alright. And that will basically execute all of the logic inside of here. That's just a little workaround that we have to do whenever we want asynchronous logic inside a useEffect hook. So if we go back now, what we're going to see is that all of the elements in our app are showing up, which is good. However, you're going to see that the upvotes number is 0. Now, assuming that you've tested out your upvote endpoint, 0 is not actually the right number, which means that something is going wrong when we're trying to load that data. And if you open up your inspector window again and go to the console, you'll see what that is. And you may have to refresh to get rid of all the old errors, but sure enough, what we're going to see is that we're getting an error that says connection refused. Now, the reason for this error is quite simply because we don't have the server running in the background. So if you ever see this error, you know why it's happening. It's just because you forgot to run the server. So let's go back here and we're going to open up our server in a new terminal. You'll want to leave the front end running. So we'll open up a new terminal and say my blog backend, and then inside here, we'll run our server with npm run dev. And now, let's go back to our browser and try and refresh this again. Alright, we'll hit the refresh button and we're going to see that the upvotes is still at 0. So what you're going to see here is that we're running into a new error, and if we go to the console, sure enough, what you'll see is an incredibly common error for beginners in full-stack development to see, and that is the error that your request has been blocked by a CRS policy, access control allow origin, blah blah blah. Chances are you're going to see this all over the place as you start working with more full-stack projects, but basically, all that it means is that our front end and back end are running on different origins, right? In this case, on different ports. And therefore, they're not allowed to talk to each other. So in order to fix this error, the simplest way to do it is to just go into our front end, my blog folder, open up the front end package.json, and we're going to add another value to this, which is going to be proxy. And the value for this is going to be the URL for our server, alright? So we'll say http://localhost 8000 and add an extra slash at the end there. And basically, what this is going to do is it's going to make the front and the back end think that they're running on the same origin, which will get rid of those errors that we were seeing. Okay. So let's close this, and we're actually going to have to restart our front end. So let's just open this up and stop it, and we'll run it again. And one more thing that we have to do is, now that we have that proxy set up, we no longer have to specify the entire URL when we make requests with Axios, right? We can just start after that localhost 8000 thing. So if we just change this now to /API/articles/articleid and go back to our browser, we should see now, these are all old errors, by the way. We should see now that if we refresh the page, the article has 3 upvotes displayed, right, which is the correct number. And if we go take a look at some other articles, we'll see different numbers for those. Chances are these are both going to be 0 because I don't think I ever tested either of these, but the takeaway here is that we're now successfully loading this article info from the server, which is great because we can now use this as a template to make other types of requests, such as when we want to add an upvote to an article or add a comment to an article. Alright. So our article page component is now correctly loading the information about the articles that it displays, and it's correctly displaying the number of upvotes that a given article has. So the next step for us here is going to be to build a new component that will display the comments for an article, right? Currently we're not displaying those comments anywhere on our page. So what we're going to do is open up our IDE, and over here, we're going to go into our components directory and add a new file here which we'll call commentslist.js. And this is going to be the component that will display all of our comments. So let's start off by just creating a very simple component with a fairly simple JSX structure. And that's going to look like this. We're going to say const commentslist equals, and this component is going to take a single prop called comments, which will be the comments that we want it to display. Alright, we're going to have our article page pass that, as you might have guessed. And then inside here, for the JSX, we're just going to say h3 heading comments. And under that, we're just going to map through all of these comments that we received as a prop. So that's going to look like this. We're just going to say comments.map. And for each comment, what we're going to do is display a div, and this div is going to have the class name of comment. That's just for styling purposes to make it match up with our CSS that we copied and pasted. Alright, and then the key for this, in order to come up with a unique key, we haven't really added a unique ID to any of our comments, but we can get pretty close by just joining together the comments posted by and text properties. Alright, that should end up being fairly unique, at least. So that's going to look like this. We're just going to say comment.postedby plus, and then we'll put a semicolon in between that, I suppose. And then we'll just say plus comment.text. And that will be the sort of unique key for each of our comments that we're displaying. Okay, so inside this div now, what we're going to do is just display who the comment was posted by inside an h4 heading. So we'll say comment.postedby, like so. And under that, we'll display the text of the comment by saying comment.text. Okay, and you'll see that we're getting this little red underline here, and that's just because we're trying to return more than one top-level element from our component. So in order to get rid of that, we just need to wrap all of this in a React fragment like so. And if we put that all in there, we'll see that that gets rid of the error. Okay. So last thing we need to do is just export this component by saying export default comments list. And that is all we need to do for our comments list for the time being. So let's go into our article page now and try and use our comments list. What we're going to need to do is just import comments list up at the top. So we'll say import comments list from /components/comments list. And now if we go down to our JSX, what we're going to do is, underneath the article's content, we're just going to say comments list comments equals comments. And that should be it. So let's try this thing out. We're going to go back over to our browser and, it looks like comments is not defined. And that's just because this here should be articleinfo.comments, not just comments. So if we go back now to our browsers, sure enough, we'll see that in addition to the upvotes up here, we have all of our articles' comments being displayed down here at the bottom. Alright, so far we've added some very nice fetching functionality to our front end. And as we've seen, every time we visit an article page, our client loads information about the article from the server, such as the upvotes and the comments, and those are displayed on the article page. Now all of this is great, but the interaction between our front end and our back end right now is very one-sided, right? In other words, our front end is just loading data from our back end, but there's not really any way currently for our front end to make changes to the back end. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add an upvote button next to this upvotes message that will allow our front end to send a request to the server telling it to add an upvote to a specific article. Alright. So let's head over to our IDE, and what we're going to do is open up our article page, and inside here, pretty much anywhere that you want above this if statement, what we're going to do is we're going to add a function that will make a request to our server telling the server that we want to upvote a given article. So what this is going to look like, we're just going to say const add upvote. And this is going to be an asynchronous function since we're going to be making a network request inside of it. And as the body of this function, what we're going to have to do is make a put request to the server endpoint on our backend that takes care of upvoting articles. So if we open up server.js here, remember that we just have to send a put request to /API/articles/name/upvote. Alright. So what this is going to look like with Axios is we're going to say const response equals await, and then we're going to use Axios.put here to make a put request. And the URL here that we'll specify in backticks will be /API/articles/, and then we're going to put in the ID of the article by saying article ID, and then we're going to say /upvote. Okay. So that'll make the request for us. And what we're going to want to do is have the server respond with a new number of upvotes, right? In other words, we're going to have our server respond with the updated article instead of just with a message like it's doing now. So all we need to do to make that a reality is say response.json here. And instead of having this message that says the article now has so many upvotes, we're going to just send back the article itself, right? And remember that in our server, the way that we're actually querying MongoDB is by basically calling update1 and updating that article. And then we're just going back and finding that article after we updated it. So by sending our article back using response.json, our article page should now have access to the updated article. And what we're going to want to do is just call setArticleInfo with that updated article info, which will contain the updated number of upvotes. Alright, so what that's going to look like, we're just going to say const updated article equals response.data, and then we just need to say setArticleInfo to updated article. Cool. So that's the function that's going to take care of upvoting our article. The next thing that we need to do is actually add a button to our page that will call this function. So if we scroll down here, what we're going to do is before our paragraph tag, we're going to add a button, and this button is just going to say something like add upvote, or to be even shorter, let's just say upvote. And what this button is going to do is when it's clicked, which we specify by saying on click equals, it's just going to call the add upvote function that we define up above. Okay. And that's pretty much all we need to do. Oh, one last thing actually that we need to do is add a div around both of these for styling purposes. And this div is going to have the class name of upvotes section. So let's add upvotes section here, and that should be all we need to do. Alright, so let's go back to the browser and take a look at our app, and sure enough, we'll see the upvote button here. And if we click on it, sure enough, we'll see that that will successfully update the number of upvotes. And furthermore, if we refresh this page, we'll see that that number of upvotes stays constant, right? So essentially what's going on here is when we click this button, we're sending a request to the server. The server is updating the data in the database and then sending us that updated data which we're displaying here. So even though all we're doing is clicking a button, there's a lot of full stack activity going on here. Great! So our website now has a way for us to add upvotes to articles, but it's still lacking a way for us to add comments. So, let's figure out a way to add that functionality. A good place to start with this, since it's going to be a fairly complex component here, is going to be to actually create a separate component that will write all of this code in. So what we're going to do is inside our components folder, we're going to right-click and say new file. And we'll add a new form to this, which we'll call addCommentForm.js. Okay. So, this is going to be a pretty straightforward component. What we're going to do is say, const add comment form. And for now, we'll just say that it takes no props, although we probably will add some of those later on. And then, let's just export this as the default export by saying, export default add comment form. Okay. So there are three basic things that we're going to want to add to our add comment form. The first thing is going to be a text input for the user's name, and in order to do that we'll say return. And first of all, we're going to put all of this inside a div with the ID of add comment form. And this is for styling purposes here. And inside here, we're going to add an h3 heading that says add a comment. Okay. So underneath this, we're going to add the input for the user's name. And that's going to look like this. We'll just say, label. And then inside here we'll say, name. And under that we'll have the input of type text, where the user will actually enter in their name. Okay. And underneath that, we're going to have something similar for the actual comment text. And that's going to look like this. We'll just say, label. And inside here we'll have comment. And under that, we're going to have a text area that the user will be able to type their comment text into. Alright, so this will just give them a little bit more room to work with than if they just typed in a single line input. So for the rows here, let's just set that arbitrarily to 4. And for the columns, we'll set that somewhat arbitrarily to 50. And that'll be the text area that the user will type their comment into. Alright. And after these two inputs, the last thing we're going to add is a button. And this button is going to say, Add Comment. And this is the button that the user will click in order to actually submit what they've entered into the form. Alright. So now that we have those two inputs, the next thing that we're going to want to do is add state to our component that will keep track of the current values inside both our name input and our comment text input. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is import the useState hook. Alright, so that's going to be pretty much just like we did inside our article page when we added state for the article info, except obviously this state is going to keep track of the values inside our inputs. So, what this is going to look like, we're going to say, const, and we'll have the name input state be name and set name. And we'll say, equals useState. And the initial value in that input is going to be an empty string. And then for the text, we'll say, const comment text. Oops, this needs to be inside square brackets here. We'll say, comment text, and set comment text equals useState. And the default value for this is going to be an empty string, as well. Okay. So now that we have both of these things, we're going to need to make sure that the values of these state variables is kept in sync with the values in our inputs. And what that's going to look like is we're just going to have to add a value and onChange prop to both of these inputs. So we'll say, value. And for our name input, we're going to say, equals name. And then we'll say, onChange equals event set name to event.target.value. Now, what we just did here is created what's called a two-way binding between our input and the value of this state. Right. So we've set the value in the input to the value of our name state by saying, value equals name. And with this onChange thing, we've made sure that the name state is kept in sync whenever the value of our input is changed. Right. So if the user types something in, that's immediately going to call setName with the new value in the input. Alright, this is just a pretty common pattern when working with forms and React. So, don't worry if you've never seen this before. Okay. So now we're going to do the same thing with our text area. So let's just adjust the indentation here a little bit. And for the text area, we're going to say, value equals comment text. And for onChange, we're going to say, event set comment text. And we're going to set that to the new value inside that text area, by saying, e.target.value. Alright. And that should keep our state variables and our input values in sync with each other. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is actually add a function that will allow the user to submit the comment that they've entered. So what this is going to look like is inside our add comment form, we're going to create a new function, and we'll call this function something like add comment. And this is going to be an async function, since it will be making requests using the Axios library. And what we're going to do in here is just say, const response equals axios.post. Alright, so we're going to be making a post request to our add comment endpoint that we created on our server. But first, let's actually import the Axios library by saying, import Axios from Axios, like so. And now, we can make that post request. So we're going to say, axios.post. And the URL, which we'll express in backticks, is going to be /API/articles. And then we're going to need to get the article ID somehow, or the article name, rather. So we'll just put that there for now, and I'll show you how to get that in just a second. And then after that, we're going to say, comments. Okay. So that's how we make that post request. We are going to need to include some extra data with that in just a minute, but don't worry about that yet, because what we're going to need to do first is get the article name. Now, an easy way to do this is just to have the article page, which is going to be the parent component for this add comment form, pass the currently selected article name down as a prop. So, all we need to do here is add a prop to our add comment form, which we'll call article name. And then, we can actually use that article name here like we've been doing. Alright. So now that we have that figured out, the last thing that we're going to have to do to make our request is add the request body. And remember, that the request body for creating a new comment is going to need to include a posted by property, which will be the name of the person that posted it. So, we're going to want to get that value from the name state in our add component form. And that's going to look like this. We'll just say, posted by name. And we're going to have the text for the comment, which is going to be the value of our comment text state here. And we'll just say, comment text, like that. Okay. So that will include that data along with this request. And, what we're going to want to do is just like in our Upvote endpoint where we had it send back the updated article, instead of just a message. With our comments endpoint, what we're going to want to do is just have it send back the updated article, as well. Right. So we'll just say, response.json and send back the updated article. Okay. So, that's all we really need to do there. Let's go back now to our add comment form. And what we're going to do here is say, const updated article equals response.data. And by the way, we do need to add the await keyword to axios.post, as well. I almost forgot that there. And then, when we get back this updated article, what we're going to need to do is actually update the article in the article page. Now this does get a little bit tricky, because the state for the article is in the article page. So what we're actually going to have to do is add another prop to our add comment form, and we'll call this, onArticleUpdated. And, all we're going to do here is have our article page pass that prop down and you'll see how that works in just a second. But we are going to have to call onArticleUpdated here with that updated article that we got back from the server. And the last thing that we're going to have to do inside this function is reset the name and comment text back to an empty string by saying, set name empty string, and set comment text to an empty string, as well. Alright. So now that we have this add comment function, we just need to have this button down here, call it. And we can do that by just saying, onClick equals add comment. And then, back in our article page, in order to make sure that our article is getting updated when we get back that response, we're just going to import the add comment form, first of all. So, underneath our comments list here, we'll say, import add comment form. From components, add comment form. And then down here, above our comments, we're going to add the add comment form. And for the props here, we're going to pass the article name, which is going to be equal to the article ID that we got from the URL parameters. And under that, we're going to have the onArticleUpdated. And all we're going to do here is pass a simple anonymous function that will take that updated article and call setArticleInfo to that updated article. Alright, so that's all we need to do to make sure that the article info in our article page is kept in sync when our add comment form gets that response back. Alright. And that should be all we really need to do. So, let's give this thing a try by going back to our browser. And sure enough, we see this nice add comment form above our comments. So let's try adding a comment here. We'll say name. And actually, let's go to one of our other articles that doesn't have any comments, so that we can see this a little more clearly. So, we'll say name Sean, and we'll say comment another great article. And then we're going to hit this add comment button, and what we should see is that the new comment will show up in this comments section down here. So if we click add comment, sure enough, we'll see that that comment is now displayed in this section. And the name and comment inputs are cleared, so that just about completes our full stack integration for our front end and back end. At this point, we've added functionality for our front end upvoting articles, loading articles, and adding comments to articles. And of course, all of that functionality is reflected in our endpoints on the back end, as well. So feel free to give yourself a pat on the back at this point. The next thing that we're going to be taking a look at is something a little bit trickier. And that is seeing how to add basic user authentication to this application, so that we can make sure that users can't come in here and do things like add a bunch of upvotes, or add a bunch of comments with a different name, things like that. So, that's what we have coming up next.